Hey guys, welcome to Amity Tracks. I hope this hat doesn't make me look like a fool later today, but go Texans. Anyway, uh, I've been wanting to do this for a while. I've been wanting to do, well, this is a kind of this will be in two parts, but two video series on Miles Davis. And I've been a big jazz fan for decades and decades. I have a decent sized jazz section in my records. The vast majority of the videos I do on this channel are not jazz oriented, right? I mean, they're rock oriented, classic rock and psychedelic rock in the '80s, and this rock and that rock, just all kinds of rock. and But I have been a jazz. We've done maybe a small handful of jazz videos here, but I've been wanting to do one focusing on Miles Davis, especially for a while. I think what held me back, in part, well, I was just trying to figure out how to structure it, kind of how I wanted to approach it. I mean, definitely do an album ranking, which will be what the next video is about. But I felt like I needed an introductory video before the album ranking to really put everything into context. And I think I hope I have finally figured out how to approach it. So this video is, I titled it, a beginner's and intermediate's guide to Miles Davis. And so in this video, I really want to sort of go through chronologically and just talk about, the evolution, how his whole career developed, and played out. This is partially biographical, but, I'll point out a lot of records, a lot of key records. I'm not ranking them in this video, but just kind of point them out kind of as we go through the timeline, because what, five, six however many decades Miles was putting out groundbreaking music, and just doing a quick ranking, unless you really know Miles Davis, would be sort of chaotic and all over the place. So, I teach for a living, so I kind of like to understand the historical context of things. And so I kind of approached this video as what video would I have appreciated when I was really getting into Miles Davis. So it's not for somebody who's like never heard of the guy. I mean, so I'm assuming most of you have sort of a base level knowledge of Miles Davis, but maybe you don't kind of know every era and all of that. So I kind of want to talk about the context and just Miles, you know, in general, and his importance as a not just musical but just a cultural figure of the 20th century, and lay all that out in this video. And then the next video is going to be my ranking of my top 20. I'm going to do 20. So my top 20, 20 to 1 Miles Davis albums. All right. So that's how I'm going to approach it. All right. So, as I said, Miles is one of the towering figures of the 20th century, right? I mean, he pioneered directions in jazz music like multiple times, really just music in general, multiple decades. He's one of the few artists I can think of. I don't know, Neil Young comes to mind in the rock realm, who, into his fourth, fifth decade, all the way to, the end of his life. Neil's still going, but, the end of his life, he was still relevant, still, well, even more than Neil, still pushing, pushing the boundaries, pushing the barriers, still a controversial artist. And I really respect that. I mean, he created cool jazz and then disowned it and moved on. He pioneered the use of modal structures and songs and soloing. Pioneered groundbreaking records in orchestral jazz. With his work with Gil Evans. Kind of took hard bop to its limits. Of course, one of the key figures in fusion, and I love that era. We'll talk a lot about that era. And like I said, was still kind of cutting edge and putting out a challenging work in the 1980s. Up to his death. It was at 1991, I believe. And what other artist in their fifth decade is still pushing boundaries and all of that, right? And it's controversial, challenging, putting out challenging work, splitting critics dramatically, on the assessment of their work, right? Something also very important about Miles Davis is kind of like Charlie Parker before him, very like a long list of very important artists sort of you know made their name in Miles's bands and then went off and did their own thing. And I mean, I just made a partial list here, right? You have John Coltrane and Bill Evans and Cannonball Adderley, Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, Tony Williams, John McLaughlin, Chick Corea, many, many more. Right? Like all those guys, really sort of Miles's group, Miles's band was sort of a proving ground, and they learned and then went off and became jazz pioneers on their own, right? Of course, Miles Davis was a trumpet player, so he expanded the vocabulary, of the trumpet, with this. It was really interesting. We'll get into this in a second. He kind of followed Dizzy Gillespie and Charlie Parker's groups for a while, but very different style from Dizzy Gillespie, right? Dizzy was his playing was very much like Charlie Parker's in a lot of ways. Miles's wasn't, which what made Miles's work with Charlie Parker kind of interesting. It was an interesting contrast versus a complement to Parker's playing. Very that introspective, that insular playing, that use of space. I've been reading Miles's very colorful autobiography. I think I've ever seen the word MFer used so many times in a book, but this is a fascinating read. I'm kind of in the midst of it right now, but it's a fascinating read. And Miles talks about in here how influenced he was by Thelonious Monk, and at least in sort of the use of space and silence, and it's just brilliant stuff, right? And of course, Miles Davis famously used the Harmon mute, for that sort of more intimate sound sometimes. But he could also, blow full out on the trumpet without the mute, and yeah, but he could play a lot of different styles, as you see. Miles was always a controversial figure, right? Personally, musically. Again, reading this book, very, uh, kind of hard edged. For instance, views on race. I mean, that turned a lot of people off. When Miles would kind of opine about that. Again, you read about his life story and all that, and you kind of understand where he's coming from there. But Miles was complex, very complex figure. So while he was very outspoken about race, again, you read this almost in sort of uncomfortable ways. Um, just look at his career. He often played with white musicians, and many of them key. Gil Evans, Bill Evans, John McLaughlin, and others. Um, I remember reading this story. I haven't gotten to it in this book. Maybe it is out of this book. I don't know. But I remember reading somewhere else one time. There were some black musicians who were kind of criticizing Miles for using Bill Evans on some of these albums. White piano player. Um, and yeah, Miles's retort was, well, you find me a black guy who can play like Bill Evans, and I'll use him. I mean, it's Miles. It's kind of interesting. You know, it's sometimes difficult maybe to get through some of the kind of facades and bluster to the real Miles. I don't know, but he's a complex figure. Complex figure. So I do think I know my Miles. Obviously, like I said, my wheelhouse is rock and roll. There are going to be some of you guys watching this who know Miles Davis a lot better than I do, but I'm going to do my best. I think I know enough, right? And so I kind of explained who I kind of thought this video was for. The Miles curious, the people who, maybe you already own Kind of Blue and In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew. And then you're like, where do I go next? So maybe somewhere there. I don't know. Even if you know them well, listen to what I have to say. See if you agree or disagree with what I'm saying. So I want to go, kind of chronologically, so this makes sense. Point out key records as we go. I'll try and kind of briskly move along because I don't like to make videos that are too long. But there's a lot of stuff to cover. And again, the next video will be just my ranking, my top 20 from 20 to 1 favorite Miles Davis albums. And I'll include live albums, studio albums, because with Miles, the live albums are key and really very unique, entities that act as their own works. So, all right. The first interesting thing about Miles Davis is his birth, right? He was in his early days as a young man. He he was born and grew up in St. Louis, but he doesn't have this sort of your typical you know jazz blues man background, whatever, growing up dirt poor. And Miles was born into privilege. His family, his father was a very successful dentist, and you know Miles, always had money growing up, which was interesting, right? So very successful middle class. In fact, he was Miles went off to Juilliard and studied music. Now he didn't finish there because he quit to just play jazz full time with Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and all those guys. But he took classes at Juilliard, so kind of a different upbringing from a lot of his contemporaries. While growing up in St. Louis, that's when he, picked up the trumpet, started playing with local bands. That whole area, St. Louis, Kansas City, that kind of middle part of the country, it was really you wouldn't think, but a lot of these really big, important jazz people came out of that area. Then he moves to New York to attend Juilliard, but he talks about in this book that was just a smokescreen for his parents. He really wanted to go to New York because that was sort of where jazz was happening, and he wanted to go find Charlie Parker and go find Dizzy Gillespie and all these guys, and he does, and he starts playing with those guys. And I guess one of many myths about Miles Davis is, you know, the style he has chosen to play in through a lot of his career is a little slower and more introspective. And so, there are some ignorant people out there who claim Miles Davis was not a virtuoso. He was. He could. You don't play as long as he did in Charlie Parker's band without knowing what you're doing, without being an amazing player. So he could play that way. He didn't. He didn't. Right. Or a lot of the time. And after Dizzy Gillespie just got fed up with Parker and left, Miles became Charlie Parker's trumpet sideman for several years. Although listening to that music, I don't, just me personally, I don't find Miles's playing style really meshing with Charlie Parker as well as Dizzy's did. So I that was only going to last so long. 1948, 1950, Miles starts, kind of working, with his own groups while he's still, somewhat playing with Parker during that time. I mean, key, and I think one of his first key recordings, he recorded before, but this one really stands out. Is he put together this groundbreaking nonette, 9 players. It's kind of a little jazz orchestra. Um, I, Very importantly, kind of the first time he works with Gil Evans, jazz arranger, white jazz arranger, Gil Evans, and as you'll see with some of their later works, they just have this amazing working relationship. They get each other, and so these, the birth of the cool recordings. Now these were put out as singles at the time because this is kind of right before LPs you know became a thing really. But later this was released as they kind of collected them all and released as an album, Birth of the Cool. And these are key where he does pioneer cool jazz. Kind of pulling back from that sort of frenetic chord changes and pace of bebop, right? That he was playing with Charlie Parker, and a much more relaxed, more arranged, kind of shorter solos, more arranged work. And Jerry Mulligan was a key player on here. John Lewis. Who else? Kenny Clark. I mean, some really important people on here. Max Roach. So But just as he pioneers this kind of music, he moves on. And later kind of famously, disliked what became cool jazz. I guess the Dave Brubeck and maybe some of the stuff Jerry Mulligan did later and all that. So see, the early 1950s, he it was kind of a troubled time. He develops a heroin addiction, claims to have even supported himself as a pimp at times. Interesting. But anyway, by the mid-50s, he's kicked the habit. He's gotten his life back together. He's recording for Prestige, the album label Prestige, and puts together, the first famous Miles Davis quintet, which is Miles, John Coltrane on tenor sax, Red Garland on piano, Philly Joe Jones on drums, Paul Chambers on bass. And he then signs with Columbia, which of course is where the bulk of his work is with Columbia Records, but he still owed Prestige these like 4 albums. So amazingly, his quintet goes into the studio and just over a 2-day period records 4 whole records. Basically, they went in and just recorded the sets that they were playing at night, in the clubs all the time. So they knew this stuff cold, and they recorded what are kind of considered classic, these classic 4 records in like two, 2 days. We're talking about cooking, working, steaming, relaxing with the Miles Davis Quintet. I've got cooking right here as an example. Just amazing, amazing stuff. And then they're able to go to Columbia and record around about midnight, around the same time period. Now this is kind of some, I don't know, cheaper version with alternate cover. This is the original cover of it, but around about midnight, which is just a stunning classic. Spoiler alert, you'll see that in my top 20 somewhere. Um, yeah, so I mean, they are just cooking. Yeah, and the somewhere around this period, he um, he goes to France and does some soundtrack work. This Ascenseur pour le chauffeur, what, lift to the scaffold. I can't speak French. I think this is key. It's real moody, and it was kind of interesting, the process. They basically kind of had the movie playing, and then they were sort of playing, improvising the music while they're watching the movie to record the soundtrack. And a lot of it's very moody. A lot of this is sort of a precursor to. It's a great picture right here. Sort of a precursor to a lot of what was to come in his sound. So I think this is a very good and sort of key record. Comes back, adds Cannonball Adderley, to make it a sextet. They record, of course, the incredibly important Milestones. And again, I'm going to dive into what I think and what these records actually sound like in my rankings. So I'm saving that. I'm just kind of pointing out sort of where they fall. And I'm not pointing out every single one of the top 20, but obviously a lot of what I'm showing will be in the top 20. But where do they fall? You'll have to wait and see. Milestones, of course, the track, pioneers that modal playing of jazz. Um, we get to the late 50s, where many consider some of his greatest works. His original quintet, sextet, kind of starts to evolve. He starts to sort of play around with personnel a little bit. And that's, of course, where he does start to work for a little while with Bill Evans. And I don't know, those of you who know jazz or know Bill Evans, is where I should do a whole video on him. Amazing jazz pianist, just with a great feel. Again, uses space very well, which I think is what Miles probably appreciated about him. Kind of impressionistic almost. Anyway, just one of the most incredible jazz pianists with his own unique style. So this is, of course, you have Miles Davis, Bill Evans, Coltrane, Adderley, Chambers, new drummer Jimmy Cobb, and Wynton Kelly on piano on one song. Record, of course, Kind of Blue, which is, I believe, still the best-selling jazz record of all time, and the one jazz record that even non-jazz fans have in their collection. And so we'll talk more about that. But the massive, massive, massively important record, right? And it was also in the late 50s. Is where he's getting very interested in very kind of ambitious orchestral jazz work. So he reunites with Gil, not Bill, Gil Evans, and makes a series of records. Miles Ahead, adapting Gershwin's Porgy and Bess brilliantly for jazz. The incredibly ground pioneering, I love this record, as you'll see, Sketches of Spain. Just amazing stuff. I do want to show you this. This is Miles Davis and Gil Evans, the complete Columbia studio recordings, and so um, it like what it says, kind of the complete work they did with Columbia. All these records I just mentioned and showed, plus alternative takes and rehearsals, and just it's complete. It's amazing. Columbia did a really good job of putting out a very large series of these box sets on CD in the 90s and the early 2000s. I don't remember exactly when they put out all these. Well, this was 1996. This one, I think. Yeah. Anyway, um, and yeah, well, when we get into my ranking, I'll show you some other ones. Where I have some of these box sets for some of these records, but just amazing stuff. These box sets. If you really want to dive in. And so getting into the 60s, he has kind of this rotating band, people coming in and out, but still release some very good records, stuff like, Someday My Prince Will Come, which I really do love, Seven Steps to Heaven, so good records, really great records. Would have been career highlights for most people, but it's just sort of this transition period for Miles. But in the mid 60s, he puts together what's known as his second great quintet, right? So it's Miles, Herbie Hancock on piano, teen drum sensation Tony Williams, who is key to the sound of this group, Wayne Shorter on saxophone, and Ron Carter on bass. So this is kind of in the hard bop style. But again, he sort of revolutionizes jazz with a series of records with this group. Stuff like ESP, Miles Smiles, Nefertiti. There you go. Albums like that. That for some people is peak Miles. Yeah, and we'll talk about that as well as far as what I think of that era. Um, Around 1967, Miles was always very aware of what else was happening in music. And of course, like everybody else, he starts to pay attention to what's going on in rock music, kind of psychedelic music, all that kind of stuff, in the late 60s. And is intrigued with electric music. In fact, Nefertiti, that one I just showed you, is the last album he ever put out that was completely acoustic. From here on out, there will be some elements or all electric music on his records, all the way to his death. And what's really intriguing, one of those great what ifs, is apparently Miles and Jimi Hendrix were talking a lot. Miles was very intrigued with what Jimi Hendrix was doing, and vice versa, of course. And they had supposedly, and I know he talks about it in here, and I've read it other places. They had pretty solid plans to work together. Like they were going to make some records together. I mean, could imagine Miles Davis and Jimi Hendrix. But you know what happened? Of course, Jimi Hendrix dies, and that puts an end to those plans. But God, what could have been there, right? Into the 70s. So anyway, so he does sort of get interested in electric music and starts to dabble, albums like the Phillies de Kilimanjaro, try to put. So he's still working with his second quintet, uh, but starting to add some other players, and they're starting to experiment with some like the electric Fender Rhodes, but still sort of have a foot in the acoustic jazz too on a few of these records. That quintet blows up, and of course everything blows up within a silent way. The birth of jazz fusion, maybe, I don't know. in a silent way. What's really interesting is, though, this doesn't really sound a whole lot like the rest of his fusion stuff. This is more like ambient space rock. There's really nothing that sounds like in a silent way in his discography. But we'll talk more about this one in the next video. Yeah, and so he is basically now leading the way in jazz fusion. And to me, this is where his influences moves way beyond just jazz, just in music in general. I mean, this music he's doing from late '60s through about the mid '70s is it has massive influences on rock musicians, on progressive rock, on people way beyond the jazz world. And where Miles becomes to me important to music, not just jazz music. And that period will be very well represented in my rankings. Just of course, Bitches Brew, of course, is a pioneering record. It's great artwork here too. Um, you know, Jack Johnson on the Corner, incredibly controversial record when it was released. We'll talk about that in the video, and then just these blistering live shows during this period, like Agartha and Pangea, or actually, this is Agartha. This is Pangea. It doesn't matter. They're recorded on the same day. Anyway, so, stuff like just amazing stuff. So from about 75 to 1980, Miles goes quiet. He goes silent. He sort of disappears into sort of this fog, this sort of period of drug use and a lot of self-destructive behavior, kind of isolation. Maybe that was the end of Miles Davis. But no, he emerges in 1980, and from 1980 to 1991 becomes very active again, kind of cleaned up, releasing a lot of albums, touring all over the place, and again, a lot of cutting edge work in his last decade of his life. Stuff like Tutu and you know, Aura and stuff like that, and even stuff like this, right? Like, you're under arrest, which oh, I love this record. I'll talk about this in the rankings. Seriously, I will. All the way to the end, like something like this, Live Around the World, which was released posthumously, which sort of a comp of live performances from the last few years of his life. Listen to this. This is fantastic. He's got a killer band with him, by the way. So even as his own abilities, are slowing down a little bit, he's still a very creative mind. He's always been smart about, who he has, with him, right? Who he has playing with him, kind of the musicians he surrounds himself with. And yeah, all the way to the end. This is great stuff. Great stuff. I mean, cutting edge, you know, influencing people to the very end. I guess one other recollection here, then we'll kind of wrap up and set up the next video. Miles Davis passed away in 1991. I was in high school. I was in band. Surprise, in high school. Although my high school, we had a pretty hip band. Let me tell you, we were actually a pretty cool band. We had like a jazz band on the side that we played. So I played jazz saxophone. Um, anyway, our band director was one of the most influential teachers in my. We all have those teachers who really made an impression, and that guy was really one of the key teachers in my life. And he was a big jazz fan. He would. He actually supplement, like a lot of teachers do. He supplemented his income by playing, jazz in groups around town, as sort of a side gig and all that. And I remember when Miles Davis died, and he came to school the next day, and he was incredibly, um, he was just like looked shell shocked, just shaken, and he, I remember we were asking him, or I asked him, what's going on, man? And I mean, all he could say, he just say Miles Davis died, and I don't know. I didn't quite understand. Yeah, I knew who he was. I didn't quite understand why that was so important. You know, and it was. You know, I mean, we are talking about one of the towering figures of 20th century music. So anyway, all right. Like I said, next episode. Well, first of all, in the comments, let's talk Miles Davis. What do you guys think? What did I leave out? What did I get right? What did I get wrong? I'm sure I'm going to have some Miles experts come in here. So let's just talk Miles Davis. In the next episode, I will have my top 20 Miles Davis albums ranking from 20 to 1, my favorites, and I'll explain why, and we'll dive into those records. So we'll see you next time.